But I want you to have this in mind before I do that. I want you to be thinking about these network security groups and the application security groups when I go back to the on-premises and bring you over to the cloud. Okay, because some of y'all might be familiar with, firewalls and ACLs and things like that that you utilize on-prem there. But these are going to be your two essential components for securing your Azure network reliably and per best practice. Okay. Now, let's talk about this here. Let's say for your on-prem environment here. Okay. This is going to be your on-premises environment on this side over here. Okay. And I'm going to draw another box over here so that this is going to demonstrate the actual cloud environment. So think about this side as being the on-premises side here. Okay. This is your on-premises environment here. Okay. And once again, over here on this side, this is going to be your Azure or your cloud environment. Now, obviously, because we're Microsoft, we're going to talk about Azure up here. Okay. So think of this as being the cloud environment on this side over here. Okay. And we're going to tie the two together. Okay. Now, when you're over here on-prem, you have, applications and you have workstations over there. You perhaps have databases over there. You have, as I mentioned, applications and you have users. You have all of those things over there on this side over here. Okay. You got your groups and things like that. Now, this thing came along called cloud environment. In our case, it's called Azure. Okay. Now, tying these two together, because you cannot, a lot of organizations, you don't have the capability or you don't, for compliance purposes, you're not going to move every single server or database application over to the cloud. So you need a connection to get you over there. Okay. You're going to need a connection to get you from over here, your on premises, to your cloud environment there. Now, we used a tool called, it's called AD Entra Connect. Okay. That tool will sync the users and the groups over here. So you don't have to log in over here a second time, as an example there. Okay. Now, you're going to have to migrate. If you want to move that workstation over there, you got to migrate it over there. Okay. Your database, you're going to have to move it over there. Okay. You cannot clone it. You're going to have to move it over there. Okay. But you want to do this in a secure way. Okay. Over here on the on-premises side, you're dealing with your on-premises firewall. You're dealing with your ACLs there. You're dealing with a lot of security components that are for your on-premises environment there. Okay. But you want to have something very similar to that when you move to the cloud. Okay. And so that's where you're going to bring in those NSGs that I wanted you to think about over there. Application security groups, your firewall. Okay. Your firewall. You have a web application firewall here as well. Okay. All of these things here. Okay. And perhaps you want to do this in a secure way using private IP addresses and things like that. So we have a feature for private access to get you over there, as well as public access as well, because you're going to want to interact with the internet, right? But you want to do it in a secure way. Okay. So you need to be able to plan and implement your security for all of these different features in the cloud, because you're going to be communicating back over here on-prem with these services over here. Okay. Because large organizations, you can have both there. Okay. So this is kind of like the foundation here. Now, obviously, you're going to do things a little different. Okay. And if you don't know a lot about how networking work, I will tell you, you're going to do things a little different there. Okay. And I'll point those out as we move along. Okay. As well. So let me pause. Is there any questions about that? How you're going to transition there? Perhaps you're not moving everything, okay, from on-prem to the cloud. So you might have to transition, but you also have to collaborate and communicate back to your on-prem environment. But you want to make sure you do it in a secure way. Okay, does that make sense? Give me a thumbs up if everybody's with me on that. Or if you have questions, feel free to come off of mute or post it there. Okay, fantastic. Okay, now
Hey,
the yes, go right
then,
ahead.
what is the name of the connection again?
Yeah, this is called your Connect tool here is called Entra Connect there. And let me show you what that looks like here too. I'll bring it up and I'll post it here in the chat window for you. We'll talk about it here. Okay. And let me post it in the chat for you too. Now keep in mind, and let me show you here. I'm going to bring this over so we can take a look at it together. And then we're continuing the conversation. Okay. So you have the Microsoft Entra Connect here. This is a syncing tool. So if you're moving, to the cloud here, this service here gives you the capability to move those resources to the cloud. It's going to help you there. And so you have these different tools here. You have one here called Cloud Sync as an example here. Now keep in mind, this is how it works. This is your own premises environment right here. Okay, your Active Directory domain services, and you want to sync the users and the groups, and you're also going to sync those your metadata for your workstations over. You're not syncing the workstation, just the metadata, the attributes there that you have in Active Directory there as well. And so it gives you that capability to sync those over. Now there are two different ways you can leverage this syncing process. You have the Connect Sync and you also have the Cloud Sync. Those are two different features available to you. If you have a single, as it shows here, if you want to connect a single on-premises Active Directory first, well, you can do that with both. But when you have multiple domains on premise and you have different users and different groups and different services running in those different domains, and you want those users and groups in the metadata for your devices to be synced over from those multiple domains, you're going to go with the Cloud Sync feature here because it's going to give you that capability to be able to do that. Okay. That way, when I'm ready to, if I have an application sitting in the cloud, and I also have a portion of the application sitting on-prem, I want to log into that application using single sign-on, meaning I want to use the same username and password that I'm using on-prem to sign in the cloud for my SaaS application, my software as a service application there. This helps you with this is what helps you do that for your single sign-on there in a secure way, because you're not passing your password in plain text. You're passing the hash of the password over there. That's one way of doing it there. Okay. Now there are different configurations you can leverage when you set up your Connect Sync and your Cloud Sync there. I'll put that information in the chat window there as well. Does that help there? I would love to go a little deeper, but because we'll have an hour, I have to move forward. But do you have any questions about that, or is that pretty clear for you? Okay, fantastic. Okay, so this is how because you don't want to recreate those profiles. You just it takes too much work for you to do that. So you don't want to do that. So that's how you get those. Once again, the users and the groups and the passwords synced over there as necessary. Okay, so now you have a level playing field there. If I move this application over here, but guess what? I can use the same username and password as I do on-prem over here. Okay. So that's one way of looking at it there. Okay. Now, going back to our securing the network, the virtual network, Microsoft manages the data centers. Okay. We are leasing services. So when you subscribe or you have an agreement with Microsoft, you don't own those data centers. You're leasing services. Okay. So you're purchasing those services based upon your demand that you need there. But you do need a virtual network. Okay. That virtual network is going to sit on top of the Microsoft data center in a region. Okay. And so you need to make sure you understand here when you create a virtual network, as an example here. Okay. You have to select when you create that virtual network. Obviously, a subscription is a billing agreement that you have with Microsoft. And so you have to select a subscription because that's going to be where you're going to, when it comes to billing, that's going to be your billing boundary there. But there's no consumption or cost for deploying a virtual network. You're going to get billed for the services that you put in the network there, in that virtual network there. You also have to select which resource group. A resource group is just a location for you to store this virtual network along with your resources that share the same life cycle there. And obviously the region here. Um, and as you can see, anywhere around the world, you can place this virtual network. Okay. So this is your foundation. Now, when you look at this from a security perspective, okay, you have to make sure, first of all, let's go here because it's going to generate what we call a site or address range. This site or address range is private, meaning it has no way of seeing the internet by default. Okay. And so it uses RFC 1918, which are site or address ranges that are non-routable. Okay. This one have to be, perhaps it's a non-routable. So 10.0.0.0/16 is a non-routable address space there. So when you create this environment, it's going to be private to your tenant. Now, my tenant name is Contoso right here. Okay. And so within my tenant Contoso, I can create this virtual network. That's the foundation. I have to have somewhere to store those resources, my databases, my virtual machines, containers, web applications, Kubernetes, all those different services there. Okay. And so this is where you're going to build that virtual network. And you also have to have what we call a subnet. The resources that you build and store in the virtual network, it's going to be stored within the subnet here. Okay. You can have multiple subnets based upon the size of your virtual network here. Okay. So I have about 65,000 plus addresses for my overall virtual network. So I can build as many subnets that's going to hold that number of addresses there. Okay. So that's kind of like the foundation there. Okay. So you need to make sure you understand that before we get into how you're going to do this securely. Okay. Any questions about that? Give me a thumbs up if this makes sense to you. If it's not clear, please, now's the time to ask questions about it. Okay. Okay. Fantastic. Okay. Now, so this is kind of like that foundation that we talked about early on there. So now let's talk about, well, how can I do this securely? I know I need a virtual network. I have to have at least one subnet there. This is going to be the roadmap to get me from my on-prem environment over there to Azure using the Connect tool as an example there. So I'm ready. I'm ready to perhaps start to migrate or start to build services once I create that virtual network there. Because when I create it, this is what it's going to look like as an example here. Okay. This is going to be that address space that I mentioned there. My subnets are here. Okay. So I have these different subnets here. Okay. And so now I'm ready to start moving resources within these subnets here, subnet 01 and subnet 02. But I want to do it securely. Okay. That's where the network security groups come in at. Okay. That I mentioned earlier there. Okay. I have these NSGs here. And this talks about, well, NSGs are just simply, these are security rules. And we'll go back to my demo environment and I'll show what this looks like in a moment. NSGs are going to control what can go into that subnet and what's going out of that subnet there. Now, I can also place an NSG on a NIC card on the virtual machine. That way I can control what's coming in on that network interface card and what's going out from that network interface card there as well. So you have that capability. So think about network security groups as just a way for you to, it's going to contain security rules. It's going to give you the ability to either allow or deny traffic to that subnet or either to that network interface card there. So you have control at that point. Because you might build resources that you want to put in that subnet, and you only want certain individuals to get access to it. You only want other certain applications and other services to have the capability to get into that particular subnet so they can get to that resource that you might have there. Okay? And so here, when you go back, let's go back to our demo environment here. And when we look at these NSGs, network security groups, these are just services, okay? Now, you see you have NSGs and application security groups here. We'll come back into about application security groups here in a moment here. When I create my network security group, once again, I have to decide on which subscription or resource group. I have to provide the name. And then I create it. Once I create it, this is what it looks like here, okay? Let's talk about these inbound security rules and the outbound security rules. This is where all the logic lies for managing that network security group. If you go to settings, right here. Now, one key thing you need to make sure, let me redo this here because I failed to put in the subnet here. When you create your network security group here, the only two places you can associate that NSG is going to be on the network interface card, that would be the NIC card on the virtual machine, or the subnets. And remember, the subnet is associated with the virtual network there. But your resources are going to reside in the subnet there. Okay? The reason why this is important because I want to control what has access to those resources, as I mentioned earlier there. So let's think about what if you want to RDP a remote into a virtual machine. You can't do that by default in Azure. You have to specifically specify what ports need to be open. Do I want to allow? Do I want to deny access? If I want to give you access to a SQL database, I have to make sure that port 1433 is available. So I have to open it on my NSG here. Okay? Now, these are the inbound security rules here. Okay? We also have a set of outbound security rules there. Okay? Now, Microsoft manages these inbound and out. We also have 3 sets of outbound security rules also here. We'll look at those in a moment here. Okay? But whenever you create Let's say, and I'm going to put it down here so that we can look at it together here, okay? Let's say perhaps this is my virtual network here. Okay. And remember I said earlier, you got to have at least one subnet. Okay, so you're going to put that subnet in here. Okay, now you can have multiple subnets within that virtual network here. So we'll say this is subnet 1. Okay, and over here we have subnet 2 as an example here. Let's get this pin over there to work. So this is subnet 2 right there. But what if I have, let's say perhaps I have a workstation in this subnet, and perhaps I have a database sitting here. Okay, now both of these subnets are sitting in the same virtual network right there, but they can communicate with each other by default. The reason why is because of these default rules here. You have no control over those default rules. You notice they are grayed out. That's not due to my permissions, that's by design. Okay, Microsoft manages these inbound security rules here. Whenever you need to create your security rules, you have to create those yourself. Okay? But if you don't do anything, Microsoft is telling you, well, you're trying to understand why that workstation and that database can't communicate with each other by default is because I'm allowing the virtual network inbound traffic. And also on the other side, on the outbound side, I'm allowing the outbound traffic to the VNet. So I'm allowing inbound and outbound traffic between these two here. But the last rule say deny all. And that's it. So if I want to be able to RDP to this particular virtual machine, I have to create a rule. That rule is right there. I have to open up port 3389. Okay? That is going to give me the ability to connect to that virtual machine that's sitting right over here. If I don't apply that rule, I would not be able to RDP to that virtual machine. Okay? Now, another key point here, you need to make sure you understand. These security rules are based off of priority. Okay? And you see, every time you create a rule, you have a priority number here. The one I created is 300. The defaults are 65,000 series here. The lower the priority number, the higher the priority. Let me write that here. The lower the priority number, the higher the priority. Okay? So it's going to look at MARDP rule first because it has the lower priority number. So it's going to be the highest, it's going to have the higher priority. Okay? And so when I create the rules that I need to be able to get access to those resources, that's how it works with your NSGs there. Okay? Now, if I want to add another rule, for example, here, I click on add, and I have to define my source, okay, the port range for the source, the destination, the service, the destination port range, the protocol, and the action. Now, the source could come from another IP address. It could come from my IP address, or it could come from a service tag. A service tag is just simply a way for me, when I have a IP addresses that might perhaps be dynamic, meaning they change a lot. But I still want whatever, I don't care if the IP address change. I still want that service to follow whatever rules I have here. So I can create a service tag. And so if I have a virtual machine that has a dynamic IP address, I don't care if the IP address change when I have my source listed as a service tag there. Or it could be the destination as well. Okay. So if it's dynamic, it doesn't matter because I'm going to map to the service tag. And so that new IP address is going to fall in line to whatever security rule I've set in my NSG there. Okay. But this is how you would create your security rules. Because remember, you have to open up the ports. By default, Microsoft is going to have it shut down. That's by design. The only thing that's going to be open are going to be the three that are you have no control over. You can't manage those at all. Okay. The services could be anywhere between what you see here. It could be anything from HTTP, HTTPS, RDP. If you're running Linux, it could be SSH. If it's SQL database, it could be SQL. Or you can create your own custom port here. So you define that there, okay, for your service. And you define the port. Now, if I create a particular port that Microsoft is familiar with, let's say, I don't know, SQL, it recognizes that SQL is port 1433. So it's going to map you to that service if it's not a custom service that you create there. You just got to decide whether or not if you want to allow or deny that action. Okay. And what that means is simply, do I want to allow access, if I have a SQL database back there, to open up port 1433? Or I could block it by saying deny. That's my action there. Then I set the priority. Now you notice by default, it gave me a total different priority number here. That's by design. Every security rule that you create needs to have its own priority number. Okay? I can't have two different ports that share the same priority number. They have to have their own priority number there. Okay? Any questions about that? Yes.
What's the point of the priority? Like priority for what?
Yeah. The priority is what order is going to look at the rule. So let's say if I want to RDP, and that's a great question, by the way. Let's say if I want to RDP to this particular virtual machine, when I hit this priority 300 rule, it's met the requirement. It don't have to go any further at that point. Okay?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. If I want, for example, this would be for port 1433 for SQL, that would be, priority 310. So once I meet, the priority of 310 for port 1433, it's met the requirement. It's going to give me access to my SQL database there. Okay. That's the reason why you have to have separate priority numbers there for that reason there. Okay. It's stateful, meaning when it meets that requirement, it goes no further. It has no need to at that point. If you tell me you want me to RDP to that virtual machine, I'm going to look for that particular priority number to see if I have that capability. And if I do, it's going to say, okay, Ralph, you can RDP to this virtual machine now. Okay. So that's a great question there. Did I answer it for you? Want to make sure.
Yes, you did.
Fantastic. Okay. Now, quickly, I want to look at the other side of this. That would be your outbound rules, because you have a different set of rules for outbound. And so let's go back. I went too far. Let's go back to where we're here. Okay. And just like you have inbound security rules, you have a set of outbound security rules here. And once again, you have these three default outbound security rules that Microsoft say, look, you cannot do anything with those. Okay. But by default, remember, this is how those resources and those subnets get to communicate with each other. because it's telling me here, just like I have an allow VNet inbound rule, on this side, I have an allow VNet outbound rule. I also have a allow internet outbound. Now, this rule is going to be modified here, coming up here in the near future. I think it's going to be in September. Because what they're saying here, if I have a virtual machine in my subnet, that virtual machine by default can go directly outbound to the internet. Okay? That's how it's set up right now. If you do nothing, it'll have the ability to go directly out to the internet. Most organizations, you're going to want that virtual machine traffic to go to a firewall first. But you're going to have to configure that. It's not going to do it by default. You're going to have to configure that because by default, it's going to send that traffic directly outbound to the internet. But once again, this rule is going away here in the near future here. So you're going to be forced to put in your rules based upon where you want the next hop to go for that traffic there. Okay? And then you would just simply create your rules just like you did for the inbound. You're just creating these for the outbound. So in this example here, if I wanted this to go to the firewall, well, I would just simply add a rule here. Okay? And I add the rule, and the source would be maybe to, I know the private IP address of the firewall. Okay, that, and I would put that as the destination, not the source. The source could be any, because I want anything that's going to go out. I don't want anything going out to the internet. I want it to go to that firewall. So the source would be any, but the destination would be perhaps the IP address, the private IP address of that firewall. So now I'm going to route the traffic to the firewall. And remember, the lower the priority number, it's going to take higher priority. So it would never reach this rule here because once I develop and create that rule, it's going to be a higher priority. The lower the priority number, the higher the priority. So we would never go to this allow internet outbound rule here because we've created a outbound security rule to say I want to send that traffic to the firewall first so that we can inspect that traffic. Then the firewall will send it out to the internet. Okay? Any questions about that? Any questions at all? Okay? So hopefully you can see this is kind of like the foundation. Now, I didn't talk about, you can also apply these rules on a NIC card also. So listen, if you have a virtual machine, as an example, right? You can associate. I could associate the same security rule, or it could be a different security rule to the NIC card on a virtual on the virtual machine itself too. Okay, so you can associate an NSG to multiple locations. You're going to hear that term associate. That just simply means I am going to map this when I create that network security group. I'm going to associate or map it to the NIC card on my virtual machine, or I'm going to map it to the subnet because I can associate it to the subnet. Those are the only two places I can apply the network security group. These are the only two places. So when I create my inbound and outbound security rules, these are the only places I can associate those rules. It's going to be on the network interface card, on the NIC card of that virtual machine, or the subnet. Okay? Is everybody with me on that? Any questions about that? Okay. Now, let's move along here. We've got a few more moments here. I want to talk about quickly ASGs, right quick. Application security groups. And I do have a image here I want to show you right quick here. The logic is always going to reside within the NSG. But when you're working with the application security groups, they're going to give you the capability, and let's go back to the whiteboard here. You notice over here, let's make this a little bigger so we can see it here. You see, ASGs enable you to reuse your security policy. So they're not there to replace the NSG. They kind of enhance the NSG, okay? All of the logic lies over here on the network security group, because that's where you're going to implement those inbound and outbound security rules there, okay? But let's say you have a category of servers, perhaps, and I'm going to put 2 boxes here. Over here, perhaps you have web servers, okay? And on this side, maybe this would be perhaps databases, okay? Over here, okay? Now, the beauty of these application security groups is that I don't have to, every time I implement a web server and put it in my subnet, because this would be my subnet as an example here. This is my subnet 1. This would be my subnet 2 here. Okay. And this perhaps would be, when you look at the overall picture, this would be my virtual network here. So within my virtual network, I have 2 subnets. One subnet supports web servers. The other one have database servers in it. But I don't want to have to apply the NSG to every time I create a web server. I don't want to have to tell it needs to have this NSG. That's where application security groups come into play here, okay? When you create an application security group, you have to create it based upon the category of the server. I can't mix the database servers and the web servers in there for my ASG. Doesn't work like that. Okay? I'm going to have a ASG for web servers. I'm going to have to have a second ASG for my database servers there. Okay? So now when I make a change, and this only applies at the subnet level. This doesn't apply to NIC cards. Okay? So whenever I need to make a change to my NSG, well, you're going to want to create application security groups for every category. So in this case, it'd be web servers and databases. And you're going to apply the NSG to the category of server, not to each individual server there. So now if I were to create another web server and place it in that subnet, it's going to automatically know that it's going to receive whatever NSGs that's going to be associated with that subnet for those web servers there. And the same would be for the databases. Ease of administration, good for security. You're keeping everything streamlined and it's going to be easier for the administrators to manage and make sure you're doing things per best practice when it comes to your security. Okay. Now, let's talk about private access. And we're going to talk about here, these resources here. Yes, I see your hand. Go ahead, please.
Okay, so you said they're separated by category. So each category will have one ASG or whatever it's called.
Yes.
How is a category defined? Is it by the subnet or is it by like resources? Because you have databases, you have web servers.
Yeah, great question. It's going to be defined over here on NSG. You're going to map this application security group to that NSG over there. Now, this is something you have to do within that virtual network there. And so let's say if I have one subnet, as I mentioned there, to have databases, I have another one to have web servers there. Once I first have to create the NSGs. Then when I create the NSGs, then I can come back and I can create the application security groups here. Let me show you right quick here. I can pull it up here. Let's see. Okay, so instead of going to NSGs, I go to application security groups here. Okay, and it's really easy to create here. Once again, always identify your subscription, the resource group, the name, and the region. Then you would just simply create that ASG here. I'm just going to put ASG 1 as an example here. Then we'll simply create it. Now I have to decide once I create this ASG, what category server do I want to map it to within my subnet, within my virtual network there. Okay. And so if I were to go to the virtual machine, for example, here. So if I come to my virtual machine here, okay, and when I look at the overall here, and they've made some changes, let's go down to this virtual machine here. Okay. And when you scroll down, you're going to see, I think I have one in this one here. I might have removed it. I think I might have removed it. I did. Okay. But for example, let's say this is a web server. Okay. If I come down to the actual, let's go to the network settings here. Okay. This is where when you scroll down, you see this is the NSG that's associated to this web server here. Okay. Now it's in this particular subnet here. But you notice there's an option here for application security group here. So if I click on the application security group, this is where I would simply add the application security group. The one that I just created there, I would add it there. Okay. Now, once I add that application security group here, okay, then it's going to give me the ability, as you're going to see here in a moment here. Let me scroll up here to the overview page here. I can associate that with whatever resource group that I wanted the subscription in the region. But in my case, if I come back to that virtual machine here, if this is a web server, that application security group would be associated to my web servers. If I come back and create another virtual machine, and I call it maybe virtual machine 002, but it's going to be for my database server, I would create a second application security group here. Okay, so I would come down and come back up here, create an application security group for the web server. Then I would associate that ASG to my my database servers in that particular subnet over there. Okay, does that help?
Yes, it does. I understand now.
Fantastic. Okay. Just remember the logic still lies in the NSG, not on ASG. ASG is just giving you the ability to characterize your servers into categories, web servers, database servers, so that you can manage your NSGs more efficiently. That's the purpose of those ASGs. Okay. When we talk about private endpoint and service endpoint, let's say if perhaps you're in the banking industry or perhaps government, you have compliances that you have to meet. Okay. You want to use private IP addresses as much as you possibly can versus public IP addresses. Public IP addresses is what you're going to need for access out to the internet. When you create those virtual networks inside of your tenant, as I showed you there, you got multiple subnets. Remember, that is a private environment. They use private IP addresses. But what if I want to use private IP addresses and associate it with resources, that I'm communicating with perhaps on the internet. Or maybe I want to block traffic from coming in from the internet and only force you to use a private IP address. This is where I could use private endpoints and service endpoints. Okay, let's take a look at those here. Let's go back to my whiteboard, and I want to show you this here. Okay, now I do have, this is for the private endpoint here. Okay, for the, I'm sorry, the service endpoint here. Let's bring this a little bigger so we can see it here. Now, what this is saying, this is why it's so important that you understand virtual networks and subnets. Even if you're a developer or perhaps a DBA, for example, you need to have this foundation. It doesn't matter what you specialize in, as an example here. But with the service endpoint right here, you notice I have a storage account. That storage account is not sitting in my virtual network on that subnet. Okay, because remember, this is my virtual network here, and you got to have at least one subnet. So this virtual machine that's in that subnet, it needs to communicate with that storage account. But I don't want it to use the internet to do that. I want it to use a private IP address. So you notice, this service endpoint service gives me the ability to have a one-to-one relationship between that virtual machine and that Azure storage account there. Okay? Because I'm bringing the storage account to the subnet. So whatever services I have in that subnet that I want to communicate directly with that storage account via a private IP address, I can do that with the service endpoint. Okay? Now let me show you this in the portal, my demo environment here. Where do you go to do this? Well, it goes back to the virtual network. So if I go back to one of my virtual networks here, you're going to notice if I go to a subnet, if I go to subnet 01, as an example here, okay, right there, okay. Now, once I go to that subnet, and let's pull it down a little bit here. There's an option here for service endpoints, okay. So if I want to have a service, now keep in mind, these are the services I can configure to use with service endpoint. I could use, this should be Entra ID. They haven't made the change of the name yet. It's been rebranded. They say have it listed as Azure Active Directory. Maybe I want to have a direct connection to Cosmo database. If I'm working with AI, cognitive services, for example, a key vault, perhaps I'm storing my keys and secrets and certificates in that key vault. And I want whatever I have in that subnet to go directly to that key vault via a private IP address. I can configure a service endpoint and give it the capability to do that. I can do it with my service bus. That would be for my applications. It could be for a SQL database, or as I mentioned earlier, for storage from the demo I showed you earlier there. Okay. Now I already have one created for storage from earlier demo there. So what I'm saying, the storage account that I've selected, I'm bringing it to this VNet1 subnet so that we can connect to it via a private IP address. Okay. Now, let's stay with the storage account because there's some additional configurations you have to do in order to close that traffic from coming from the internet to that storage account. I'm going to show you what that looks like here in a moment here. But just know when you're dealing with the service endpoint, you're limited to these services here. Okay. This is, I call this more of the legacy service because years ago when I started working with Azure, this was the only option you had, service endpoints. Now we have private endpoint, and we're going to get into our private endpoint coming up here in a moment here. But you have limitations with service endpoint. You do have the ability to connect to these services, and that's it with the service endpoint. You notice I haven't mentioned anything about connecting back to the on-premise environment with the service endpoint, or having the ability to communicate perhaps with a different tenant outside of your tenant, because you don't have the capability to do that with the service endpoint. So you're limited to certain things. All of those limitations I just mentioned, you have the capability to do those things in the private endpoint. We're going to get into that in a moment, okay? But first I want to go to the storage account. But before I do that, any questions about where you go if you want to implement service endpoint? And remember, you're limited to these services here when you're working with a service endpoint. But this will give you the ability to use a private IP address with whatever service you're going to map it to. But these are the services that you can map it to. Okay? Any questions about that? Okay? So if we stick with the storage account, if I go to a storage account, that's an example here. And let's say if I go to the storage account here, when you're configuring the storage account, there's a security and networking section right here. Okay. Now this is going to be specific to the storage account. Okay. Now here, the storage account has what we call firewalls and give you the ability to map to certain virtual networks there, subnets. Okay. These are the settings when it comes to public network access. Now, let's say if I've created that service endpoint because I want to close this public network access. Well, I'm going to have to come in and say I want to disable that access. I cannot delete it. I can't remove it. Only thing I can do is disable. So now there's no traffic that can come into this storage account from the internet because I'm disabling it. Okay. Or I can say, I want to enable traffic to that storage account, but I want to select the virtual networks. So if I currently have existing virtual networks, well, and I do, I can select those. Let me select the subscription. And then I can come down and say, okay, I want to only have VNet 1, and then I can specify the subnets. Because remember, the resources are sitting in the subnet, not directly on the virtual network. So I can specify the servers, the subnet here. Now this is showing subnet 2 because I already configured the service endpoint with that subnet 2. But I can come back and say I also want to configure with the subnet 1 here as well. And so now what I'm saying is that now any services that I have in subnet 1 and subnet 2 can communicate with the storage account via that service endpoint. Okay. So that's a security way of setting it up. Now, if I want to perhaps specify, address or site address ranges, let's say if I'm a consultant and I'm working remotely and I need to get access to the storage account, well, I'll have to give you my public IP address and then I will put it there. And so now I will be able to connect to the storage account from my let's say my remote office or from my home office, in addition to these virtual networks that I've configured there. Okay. But from a security perspective, you might not want that because remember, I cannot delete that connection to the public access, I can only disable it. And so if a hacker gets into the environment, they can easily come back and enable that service. So that's some of the limitations. That's where the private endpoint will come into play. This is a true private connection, meaning I don't have to disable anything. Okay. By design, this is kind of like a network interface. Okay. And when I create that private endpoint, it's going to say, look, you have the ability to connect to this storage account via this private IP address. Anything that needs to connect to the storage account, it's going to have to come through that private endpoint there. So let's say perhaps if I'm working here at Microsoft and at your university, for example, I need to do some work there. Okay, we need to collaborate there, but we need to do it in a secure way, very private IP address. You have an agreement with Microsoft, so you have a tenant, and maybe my tenant is called Contoso. Perhaps your tenant is called Fabricam, as an example there. But we're doing business together, but we want to do business via a private IP address. Microsoft, we're leasing services. We both are leasing services from Microsoft. And so Microsoft is saying, well, guess what? You guys can use the Microsoft backbone. Microsoft has its own network. Okay. So we both are leasing these services from Microsoft. So why can't I connect to you via private IP address? Well, you can. And I can do that with the private endpoint. Now, there's some things I have to configure to do that. But the premise here is that I can do this outside of my tenant if I'm doing business with another organization there. I can do this back to the on-prem environment. So I have more flexibility when I'm working with a private endpoint connection versus using a service endpoint connection. Okay? Any questions about that? I know I went over a few minutes there, but these are the important pieces I wanted to talk about today. Any questions at all? I want to open up the floor, give you an opportunity to ask questions there. And perhaps you need some additional information. And if you do, I'll make sure I put that in the chat window for you. Okay? But I just wanted to recap, we talked about NSGs. We talked about application security groups. It starts with the virtual network. Remember, you have to have at least one subnet configured in that virtual network. We talked about going from on-prem to the cloud. There, you can sync your users and your groups and your metadata for your virtual machines over there, or if you have Active Directory attributes that you want to sync over there as well. But once you're over there, well, you can log on with the same password that you currently use if you're using it on premise, the same username and password. Because I've essentially cloned your identity over there in Azure there via the sync tool that I mentioned there. But then when you're over there, you got to have your resources in those subnets, but you want to make sure you're managing those securely. You do that, inbound traffic, outbound traffic from that subnet, your network security group. Remember that the network security group, you can also associate it to the NIC card. Those are the only two places there. The application security group gives you ease of administration because you can group your servers based on their category there. And then we talked about, what if I just want to use private IP addresses to get access to those services? Well, you have two ways: service endpoint, private endpoint. Private endpoint gives you more flexibility. You can communicate with services on-prem. You can communicate with another tenant outside of your organization. very private IP address because you're using the Microsoft backbone there. Okay. So any questions at all about that? Do you need any additional information? If so, make sure you get that information there. Okay. Andreski, anything you would like to add there?